Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 6th event of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies Decolonising Europe series. My name is Beste İşleyen. I'm the co-convener of this series together with my colleague Tasnim Anwar. We are both based at the University of Amsterdam in the Department of Political Science. And for those of you who are here for the first time, we started this series before the summer break. We had our kickoff event on June 17th. And then we had 4 events afterwards. And if you haven't watched these events or attended these events, you can go to the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research to watch the videos. We have now a new program, and today is the kickoff event of the After Summer program. And I'm really happy to welcome 2 distinguished colleagues to talk about decolonizing Indonesia. And our speakers adopt a historical colonial perspective on issues of economic expropriation and ecological destruction in Indonesia. And today we will touch upon topics such as how the colonial ties of current economic conditions and practices in Indonesia, and we will pay particular attention to how past interventions by the Dutch East India Company and the Dutch colonial state have set conditions for extraction, land grabbing, and cultivation of indigenous knowledges in Indonesia. So I want to introduce our speakers. I'm really happy to welcome today Dr. Lisa Tilly, who is a lecturer in politics in Birkbeck University, London. So Lisa's research interests lie in critical approaches to political ecology and political economy, and she engages also closely with critical geography and urban studies. Lisa is interested in the colonial question to analyze environmental harm and extraction with a special focus on frontiers of the capital in Indonesia. And our second speaker is Tamara Sukarno, who is a PhD researcher at the International Institute of Social Sciences at Erasmus University Rotterdam. Tamara is interested in a wide range of themes connected with the colonial question in Indonesia, and these topics include, among others, conflict studies, divided societies, post-development critiques, politics of identity, and other knowledges. And her current research is entitled From Living Together Apart to Peaceful Coexistence, Discursive Practices of Peace and Conflict in Ambon, Indonesia. So welcome, Lisa and Tamara. I'm really happy to host you today. So I want to start with a broader question. So I have really enjoyed reading your work and engaging with your work. And both of you in your work on Indonesia caution us against conflating decolonization with decoloniality. So I would like to ask you what you mean by this. Tamara and Lisa, who wants to start first?
I think Tamara should go first.
Okay, thank you. I think from what I understand about decolonization and decoloniality, decolonization is a process of the European colonizers leaving the colonies. And that process started mostly after the Second World War, that resulted in independence and formation of new nation states. In some cases, those independence were fought for, and in some cases they were given by the colonizers. That is decolonization. Decoloniality is about the logic that delinks from the colonial logic of oppression. So colonialism, in terms of European nations colonizing half of the world, might be over, but the logic of coloniality still exists. So decoloniality is to delink from that logic, and this might relate with the term that we use to decolonize, or decolonizing as we use today. And in that sense, to decolonize can mean to leave the colonies, but also to delink from the logic of oppression. And I assume when we use to decolonize today, or decolonizing Indonesia as in our subject, we are not necessarily talking about the colonizers leaving the colony, but actually we are talking about leaving that logic of oppression. That is my understanding.
Well, thank you, Tamara. Lisa, do you want to follow up on this?
Yeah, thanks, Tamara, and thanks to Best and Tasneem for putting this together and inviting us to speak today. I think Tamara kind of just covers the question really brilliantly there, and I think that, you know, the specifics of those two terms, really those two terms are quite fluid in the way that they're actually operationalized by whoever's using them. But what I think Tamara's work does really well, she has this exceptional clarity in the way she uses the concept of decoloniality in the analysis of the Indonesia context, and not to repeat what she's said already, but you know, what we're left with beyond independence and beyond decolonisation is this context of coloniality in which, you know, the political transformation to formal independence hasn't generally been matched by, you know, economic decolonisation or land and property reform or the wholesale transformation of legal and education systems and so on. So all of those systems and structures which were brought by Europeans are still there. And this means that, you know, you still have the same basic financial system with its constant orientation towards debt traps and extractive structures. And so decoloniality really names this condition beyond independence in which the formerly colonized still have to fight to unravel, you know, the remaining systems of coloniality. But I think where the literature might raise some alarm bells with some people is with a kind of perceived shift away from material concerns and the breaking down and the overthrow of structures of extraction at the expense of a shift within the decoloniality literature towards a focus on language and representation and symbolism and this kind of thing. So to consider some of the figures of the decolonial school of the Americas, which is really dominant here, I think Antiblackness in the early days had a real grounding in material struggles, whereas Mignolo in more recent work has been very dominant, and he's had much less of that grounding in material struggles, which has brought him a lot of criticism from indigenous intellectuals, people like Silvio Rivera Cusicanqui, who've criticized him and others for precisely being disconnected from indigenous struggles and their material concerns. And I think this kind of rift here in some ways goes back to the old tension between material and representation, which, you know, we all know to be a false binary, really, because representation really does have bearing on the material outcomes of people's lives, right? We know this from the long history of race. First comes racialization, then expropriation, and on it goes. But I think that the challenge is to hold these two in analysis and always in relation. And I think frames of analysis like, for instance, the Black radical tradition have done this much more fluidly with racial capitalism, so never losing sight of the structural and the material, while always holding in mind that not everything can actually be reduced to the economy, right? Some things go beyond that. So yeah, I mean, overall, I see why some people have been pushing back against this language of coloniality in favour actually more of a broader understanding of decolonisation as a material struggle to bring about the unfulfilled goals of anti-colonial struggles. But for me, I think the terminology is less important than the political horizon itself, which has to envisage post-extractivism, decarbonisation, anti-racism, anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, feminism, all of these as a kind of wholesale horizon of liberation, basically.
Well, thank you both for the very substantial answers. So I want to connect the first question to Tamara's hesitation about a historical event, Bandung. So Tamara, can you tell us a bit more about what Bandung is as an historical event? and why you are hesitant about it, and why you invite us for a rethinking of Bandung as a decolonial act.
Okay, that Bandung Conference, I think internationally known, or even in the book that was edited by Robbie, was that it was called Bandung Conference. Bandung was the location. In Indonesia, the conference was known as Konferensi Asia Afrika, Asian African Conference. So in a way to make it clear that this is the first conference of Asian and African nations, the newly born nation out after colonialism, right? Now, that was the first conference of people of color. And that was the first time where all these nations came together to declare themselves as sovereign nations that, you know, equal to others, where they can sit and discuss about their own problems and solutions to those problems. Now, Walter Mignolo put Bandung as the foundation for decoloniality. Now, I don't necessarily challenge that. To make it very clear, I don't necessarily want to say that Bandung cannot be the first foundation for decoloniality. It is. It has its valid points. And I suppose your question arises from the book chapter that I wrote together with Rosalba Icaza, right, about the meanings of Bandung. Now, my point was that first, Bandung can be seen from the external, but also from the internal. Now, seen from within Indonesia, Bandung has some problems that we cannot deny. First of all, the formation of Indonesian nation state was not necessarily a decolonial process. Yes, we've struggled, we fought against the Dutch, but then after that, we fought for independence. I shouldn't say we received independence, right? But then after that, we have to acknowledge that the whole formation of nation state was based on the process of unification. So to unify this archipelago to become one nation state means there are internal process of colonization. And unification also implies uniformity in terms of everything has to be similar, because we are trying to make ourselves as one nation. So that is one point. Second, the aftermath of Bandung. After Bandung, we, as an Indonesian nation state, we actually invaded West Papua, for example. And that's an act of colonization. And also after that, if we take decoloniality as the linking from the colonial logic, in 1965, we had the whole massacre that, basically killed everybody that was assumed to be related with the Communist Party or with communism as an ideology. And mind you, communism here means everything that is related with either socialism or anything that is not capitalism. So in that sense, we didn't actually delink. So as someone who looks at Bandung from the inside of Indonesian nation state, I cannot deny the fact that we should question these aspects. Did we actually delink? Yes, we probably initiate or even hosted this great conference, but in the end, did we follow through? And unfortunately, the answer was that we didn't. In fact, today we can see that we embrace fully the global capitalist project, and to the extent that we launched the project full force. So that was my hesitation of why I would still put Bandung as the foundation for decoloniality, but with notes. And these are very significant notes in my point of view.
Well, thank you, Tamara. It also connects very well with Lisa's research on the linkage between contemporary capitalism in Indonesia and its colonial history. So my question to you is, what does it mean to develop a decolonial approach to political economy when analyzing Indonesia? Your work offers important critiques when it comes to issues such as economic development, for example, or the concept of the emerging market or investment capital. So you offer a decolonial perspective to all these discourses. Can you unpack these for us a little bit?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'll certainly try. I'm not sure that what I do is always really explicitly decolonial, but certainly the type of political economy I aspire to does incorporate at least a kind of deconstruction, or in plainer terms, simply analysis of of concepts that are presented to us constantly as natural and ontological, rather than, you know, performative concepts which are made out of specific histories and which are designed to bring a specific set of relations into being. So again, without losing sight of the material and structural implications of those representations and the horizons of political possibility that we should be working towards. So, so for instance, with ideas like improvement, I mean, much better people than me, people like Tanya Lee and Brenna Bandar and Eloise Weber have shown how improvement has long been a doctrine and a regime which has facilitated expropriation, going back at least to Lockean notions of improvement. And I've tried to build on this a little bit recently in the analysis of still expanding plantation frontiers in the Indonesia context, to show that what was sold as European improvement in the form of industrialized agriculture actually has driven plantation economies relatively rapidly, you know, especially in terms of geologic time, towards ecological collapse, basically. So these contradictions that come with European notions of improvement are so evident in the present. And similarly with this idea of the emerging market and the making of investable spaces, I've tried to analyze how these kind of seemingly positive things have a specific function in terms of opening up areas for extractive capital and positioning people and spaces on the racial hierarchies of the international as well. So with this concept of extractive investability and the emerging market, I was trying to trace from the Dutch East India Company through the Dutch colonial state, through to the emerging market construction in the present, how today's Indonesia or parts of it have been constructed as investable through these active efforts of agents who seek to create spaces for European or other international extractive capital. So this covers really the making of plantation economies out of Java and Sumatra, the formation of the Dutch cultivation system, which drew in substantial European capital, all of which leaves very little value locally and enables the extraction of profit for investors. And then in the present, this term emerging market was explicitly formulated actually to replace the term third world by investment architects. And on the grounds that this term third world had been so degraded from its emancipatory roots that third world investments basically had negative connotations. So emerging market is a trick to inspire investor confidence, to send their extractive capital back to those areas of the global south which had come to be seen in an equally problematic way as kind of dangerous and risky.
Thank you, Lisa. Another common theme in your research is the question of race, and you approach this question from slightly different yet interconnected perspectives. So Lisa, in your work, also together with other colleagues like Robbie Shilliam, you argue that race is largely missing in research on political economy, although it is a constitutive element of European colonial domination. And Tamara, you are more adopting an inward-looking exercise, and you point to the local histories of marginalization in Indonesia. So I want to ask both of you whether you can elaborate a little bit on the importance of race when we make research on Indonesia. I don't have a preference. Who wants to start?
Maybe to continue with the previous question, Lisa first.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So, yeah, I mean, my frustration comes really from studying political economy and making it all the way to PhD level without ever hearing the R word in any classroom once. You know, this is really the problem. And that's really not to say that excellent work on race and political economy doesn't exist. It's just been generally censored from the canon and especially from teaching curricula. So again, you've got the living archive of the Black radical tradition is there. All of those incredible Caribbean political economists who theorized the plantation economy and its global kind of implications. So people like George Beckford, Lloyd Best. Then you've got, Angela Davis back in the 80s doing women, race and class. And all of this is political economy, but it's left out of curricula and conversations. So yeah, and the political economy on Indonesia that I was first introduced to really came from Europeans and white Australians who have their own particular obsessions. For them, history starts in the 50s or the 60s, and it starts with dictatorship, and then everything after that is the puzzle of how a naturally authoritarian country, and a Muslim majority one at that, how this country can democratize and liberalize economically. But of course, those same European political economists, there's patrimonial politics and corruption and prem-man gangsters and all of these sort of sinister authoritarian elements, which are presented as natural and endemic and have no specific history, and of course are a complete contradiction with the liberal nature of the West. So my tone here is a little bit sarcastic, of course, but the point is that mainstream Western political economy racializes Indonesia as a naturally corrupt and authoritarian space in which this 350-year history of Dutch colonialism never happened, never left a mark. So there's that, but then there's also the fact that those long centuries of Dutch colonialism established racial hierarchies internally in various ways. So through the colonial bureaucracy, through the plantation labor orders, and Western political economy tells us really nothing of this and what the legacies of this is. So, and actually, if I read someone like George Beckford, who's writing principally on the Caribbean, economy on Indonesia itself, and then you have all of these really great works by Indonesians themselves. So you've got Pramodia using a literary register to really finely detail the complexities of racial hierarchies and how these organize social life, all the way to Tan Malaka's 3 volumes of prison diaries, which are so rarely drawn on in the same way that other major anti-colonial works have been. So it does trouble me that the anti-colonial and anti-racist archive from Indonesia itself is not drawn on more in wider contemporary work on the country. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. So I want to make a small announcement. So our Q&A is about to start. You can send us your questions, and I would like to ask you to use the Q&A box and not the chat box. So Tamara, do you also want to? Yes,
for me, the encounter with race came much later. I mean, I grew up not necessarily touched about race, in touch with racial issue or racism issue. But then it becomes more clear when I moved to Europe. I obviously am the other, and I obviously look different, and therefore it's very clear that I obviously, I'm not as worthy as the white European Dutch person, especially if they're male. So for me, my work emphasized on race because you cannot speak about decoloniality without touch upon race. Racism is a structure that creates hierarchy and, that defines one group of people as the one who's worthy and therefore can be entitled for everything in the world, including, including telling others what is their worth and what should they do. And the other group of people as perhaps not even human being, and therefore for me race is important. I came here to study development studies. International development also includes racism, but unfortunately we never really mention it. and teaching foundations of political economy, again, you don't mention this, but then how can you understand discrimination, and how can you understand hierarchy between developed countries and developing countries without understanding racism? So that's first. Second, I think by understanding racism, or only by including race in the discussion, can we in Indonesia actually understand marginalization of people from the East, or marginalization of indigenous communities, because only by understanding race, Lisa already brought, for example, Pramudia Anantatur's, how he basically unpacked the complexity of the social hierarchy that includes race, right? So only with understanding race can we understand the social hierarchy in Indonesia, the privilege of those who are connected or who has, Dutch blood, for example, the Indo, in comparison with those who are indigenous. Now, note that in the Netherlands, this is completely different, because the Indos in the Netherlands would be the second-class citizen. But in Indonesia, they are, they inherited their Dutch ancestors' blood, and therefore also power and supremacy, I suppose. Also, then by understanding race, we can unpack privilege that allows us to continue looking down upon laborers, for example. And if there are protests on the street, we saw them as nuisance and not as valid struggle that we should actually take on board. Also, to understand the problem of global political economic system, why we embrace global political economy and are willing to enslave ourselves within the system, partly is because we are trying to be the developed nation, and not knowing that, or forgetting that this hierarchy was created also on the basis of race and racism. And to continue Lisa's point, for example, why Indonesians' life or indigenous lives does not matter as much as European life. And therefore, this justify appropriation of indigenous land on the name of development. We are trying to better ourselves, and being indigenous equals being backward. And therefore, if we're taking your land for plantation, that means we are bettering the country, and you shouldn't struggle to resist. And you should actually embrace this. You should be grateful that we're actually develop you. So this continues because we didn't really necessarily discuss about race. And that's why, for me, it's important as an Indonesian to bring this word up front in our discussions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tamara. It's really insightful. So my last question to you is, what is the relationship between decoloniality or decolonial research and engagement with indigenous movements or activism? Do you have any ideas or experiences to share with us? Who wants to start? Lisa?
Shall I start so you can take a breath, Tamara? Yeah, so thanks. This is a really interesting question, and one that I've grappled with a lot. I think there is actually always a bit of a bind here, because engagement with indigenous struggles and indigenous knowledges always requires, of us a particular ethic of engagement, which is quite difficult to get right. So since Linda Tuhiwai-Smith and many other really incredible indigenous scholars from various parts of the world, they for many years have cautioned us of the violence of the research process for those who have so long been the objects of anthropological study, for those who have literally had their skulls measured to determine their cognitive capacity and their relative humanity and so on. But thankfully now there is a really vast archive of great published texts by indigenous intellectuals who represent themselves, they represent their communities, and their cosmologies and ontologies in really illuminating ways. And I think it's really vital that we continue to center these accounts in our analyses, because across this really expansive diversity of very dynamic social and nature relations within indigenous ways of being, can be found blueprints for living in a different way, basically, to our what is otherwise our very homogenous, growth-focused, individuated, sort of property and consumption-centered lives, which characterize global capitalism. And I think, you know, this is kind of possibly coming from Marx. You know, the major mistake of Marx was to identify pre-capitalist forms of organizing life as kind of worthless and backward and in need of sweeping away through imperialist capitalism in order to get to communism. So maybe that sort of perception has been spread through leftist kind of thinking around indigenous ways of being, but so, you know, there are obviously ways of organizing society around collective compassion and in relation with nature, which have actually held firm, but in a very dynamic way, against 500 years of colonialism and against all the odds. So, whereas I think Europeans have a particular obsession when they're looking for solutions with constructing something new, which they can themselves claim to have birthed or come up with. Whereas what we really need is much more humility to engage relationally with these dynamic indigenous ways of being, with a view to breaking down these systems which are killing all forms of life, and especially racialized life in nature. So yeah, basically I'd say it's politically vital to engage with indigenous intellectuals and signal boost their work and engage with their work, while remaining really conscious of our ethics of engagement with that work and with those communities.
Thank you, Lisa. Tamara, do you want to follow up?
Yes, thank you. I think, well, decoloniality is mostly about doing, not necessarily about thinking, and therefore you have decolonial thinker or doer and thinking or doing. And in that sense, for me, decoloniality starts from the ground, from experience. I don't think as a scholar, I would arrive at decoloniality without actually experiencing life that I experienced, without actually encountering people on the ground. Therefore, my hesitation usually when attending seminars or lectures about decoloniality as a theory, because I think that's very problematic. Decoloniality started from the ground, from real experience. In terms of decoloniality, I think related with indigenous movements or struggles in Indonesia, decoloniality is not only about delinking from global capitalist system, but it's delinking from the discourse built by the West in general to reduce the West or European experience to size, to localize that experience. And in that sense, for example, if we look at struggles in Indonesia, mostly people align their struggle with the left or with Marxism. That's kind of very, you know, that's the peak of resistance. But very few actually go back to their indigenous roots and look for wisdoms there. Now, Marxism provides solution only to a certain extent, because what we often forget is that despite its criticism, Marxism was still born out of the context of struggle in the West. And in that sense, the idea of class in Marxism perhaps does not necessarily match the condition of class or the division of class in Indonesian context. Therefore, it's important to also remind ourselves that, you know, Marxism is great, but perhaps we can only walk with Marxism to a certain extent. More than that, we need other tools. And these tools are available to our disposal within our own context. We just need to look back instead of keep looking forward. And I try to, you know, from time to time, whenever I have discussion with friends who are still on the ground working with struggles, to say that, hey, perhaps we are too colonized, that we forgot that you know, we need also our relations with our nature, and we also need to look back to the teachings of our ancestors, to look back at our roots instead of, you know, fighting the masters with their tools. And few weeks ago, some time ago, a friend of mine saw a post that I posted on social media about decoloniality, and he wrote me and said, "Can you explain more? What is this? And, you know, how do we actually work with this on the ground, in the villages, in rural areas?" And so I had a very long conversation with him and said that, you know, you've actually done that. You've actually practiced decoloniality, and you've done everything to delink from the West. So perhaps you didn't are not familiar with the term, with the jargon, but you've done it. So we only need to look inside, or using the linearity of time where, you know, the West is in front of us and our past is there, our ancestors is there, our roots is there. Perhaps we need to turn around and to recognize that, you know, if we keep using the West as our point of reference, we will never catch up, no matter what. And forever we will be the supplier for the wealth of the West, but we will never be, you know, the master of our own life. And in order to do that, we actually need to acknowledge that our wisdom are worth more than what we thought they are. So that's my 2 cents on this question, I suppose.
Well, thank you, Tamara. Thanks for the excellent answers. So we have some questions, but before that, there is one specific question. So in the previous sessions, our speakers also mentioned some readings, and our participants are very much interested in these readings. So one of the attendees is asking whether you can share the scholars, the Indonesian scholars that you mentioned during your talk. I think this is primarily related to what Lisa has said. So yeah, if you have some time, Lisa, we are happy to also share it through our newsletter, or maybe if you follow us on Twitter, the Twitter account of ACES, we would be very happy if Lisa, you could have some time to write these down. Okay, so the Q&A, we have a question from Rahardika Uttama. Thank you for an insightful discussion. I have 2 questions. The first one is, I am wondering if you could discuss further how decolonization and decoloniality changes over time from Indonesia under Sukarno to Suharto's rapid modernization and to contemporary Indonesian political and economic climate regarding Indonesian West Papua relations, etc. And the second question is, can you elaborate further how to understand better the 1965-66 massacre from the decoloniality point of view? I don't know who wants to address these questions.
So I don't mind going first if you want to have a breather, Tamara.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tamara has pretty much already spoken to this in terms of this particular era of early independence under Sukarno, where you know, you had the Bandung moment, and Indonesia was really a beacon for anti-colonial struggles across the world, and underneath all of that, of course, you have the West Papua question going on. So you have this simultaneous, very high-profile anti-colonial struggle, process of decolonization, whereas at the very same time you have a process of colonization of West Papua, which is very deliberate and a very strongly orchestrated campaign along which every political question seemed to hang, actually, throughout the 50s and into the 60s, up until the actual kind of vote for independence, which a small group of West Papuans were sort of pushed into, which has obviously been contested ever since. So this is really the big contradiction on which Bandung lies, and on which the Sukarno era and the way that it's remembered as an era of anti-colonial struggle, of delinking, of, you know, one in the eye for the West, and all of that kind of thing. Because then what it led to is a situation where, you know, today West Papua is a real occupied colony. There's no other way of describing it, you know, and solidarity with West Papuan friends over there who are struggling day in, day out against that. So basically what happens is you end up with, you know, a native kind of third world occupying force, which international capital works through, basically. So again, West Papua is so rich in terms of natural resources, and it's there for the purposes of extraction. You know, it has one of the biggest gold and copper mines in the world, the Grasberg mine, and that has been absolutely so central to the story of its recolonization. And now you have the plantation frontier expanding very rapidly across West Papuan territory. So all of this is really in the service of international capital, right? Even though the Indonesian military are doing the dirty work of occupation. So these questions are really, really thorny around colonization, decolonization at the same time, and a broader context of coloniality, which all Indonesians are sort of trapped within those structures at the same time as they might play a particular role in sort of reproducing the colonization of West Papua. So I don't know if I'll leave it there. I don't know whether you want to add to that, Tamara.
Yes, I have to say that this is a very tricky question to answer, because no matter how I answer it, there would always be room to misunderstand my answer. So let me put that there to be clear. From Suharto to from Sukarno to Suharto, as I mentioned before, we get our independence, but we did not necessarily get rid of the logic of oppression. We basically use the same structure, as Lisa already pointed out as well. Under Sukarno, there were several hints of possibility to actually finding our own identity. For example, if you look at the convention, the economic development direction under Sukarno, that was quite different, because you look towards socialism rather than necessarily, or Sukarno's word, marhainism, rather than full-blown capitalism. But then everything changes under Suharto with the project of development, right? And everything was oriented toward the West, particularly United States of America. The whole modernization development project was directed toward that. Now, in relation to this, the 1965 massacre was basically to eliminate other possibilities. That other possibilities might be communism, but also might be any other possibilities that instead was just labeled communism and, you know, erased altogether. So in terms of this, you can say that from the coloniality point of view, we would look at the massacre of 1965 as the erasure of any other possibility or any other way of existence outside of the framework of development that was introduced under Suharto or before Suharto. So that 1965 massacre was the entry point to go for full-blown development project. Now the question of West Papua, I think this is also why race is so important in talking about this, because the land is rich, but the people don't look the same with the rest of the group. And if you take race and racism into account, you know, the hierarchy of the skin color, then West Papua is on the far end to be marginalized, closer, you know, very far from the white European human, right? So race plays a very important role. At the same time, then it's important. Then it allows us to understand why then it's okay for Indonesia to just take the land and discard the people. there is no other way to call what happens in West Papua right now rather than colonization. Because what we have is settler colonialism, right? We have moved people from Java and other places in Indonesia to this land that we considered empty under the guise of transmigration project. And we completely erase the idea that this land is not empty. This is indigenous territory. All the mountains, all the valleys were considered sacred. But we didn't consider that important because using the colonial logic, indigenous belief no longer matters. So it justifies coloniality, the logic of oppression, that also justify erasure, allows us to basically take the land and discard the people, and at the same time deny that we are doing anything bad to the people. Why? Because we are developing, we're helping them to develop themselves. So we kind of achieving 3 different targets at the same time. So yeah, but again, I have to say that this question is a complicated one, and it's not very easy to answer this, considering also my position as an Indonesian scholar.
Well, thank you both. We have several other questions, and we will unfortunately not have enough time to answer all of them. But one question I think also connects to what you both briefly mentioned about the local elites and the nation building process and what kind of role they played. And you approached it from the delinking perspective, and that delinking did not really happen in the Indonesian case, especially because these local elites also maintained some of the colonial structures. One question is from Naima from Indonesia. So I would like to ask the roles of former institutions' influences from colonial time to nowadays on natural resources management, especially sea, spatial, and marine resources management. Coastal and small islands management law shows tendency that central government is to take control over sea use licensing and prioritizing national strategic project over local agendas, while tilting everyone and institutions as business entity, including local communities and indigenous populations. So because I do not have a lot of knowledge about Indonesia, is it a too specific question, or do you have an answer?
Whose question again? Sorry, to clarify.
Naima's question.
Okay.
Yeah, this is, oh, sorry, I was going to say this is really fascinating, but I know absolutely nothing about marine resources management, shamefully, so I can't really speak to that, but it's something that I'd certainly look into.
No, I will try, not perhaps the best answer, but first of all, let's address the local authority, right? After independence, it's about, okay, the Indonesian state has already been transferred to the Indonesian government. Whatever happens afterward is no longer the responsibility of the colonial power. So corruption is the biggest, black goat to blame people. Whatever happened in the country is because of corruption of the elite. Now, how did the elite start to learn about corruption? If we trace it back long enough, we will find out the colonial roots of corruption as well, bribery and all this kind of things. So if we look at it from decoloniality, that's again go back to the fact that, yeah, you decolonize in terms of leaving the area, but the logic is still there, the logic of oppression, the logic of, of using people and natural resources for your own need. So it's there, so the logic is still there. And again, I would say that in order to understand corruption in Indonesia, it's not necessarily enough to just point fingers at people and say, because you're corrupt, because you're naturally corrupt, without actually looking at the roots of corruption as a system. And that's perhaps, it's not just about individual, but it's about the structure. And this structure has its colonial origin, which perhaps we don't have time to unpack here. Now, about institutional influence from colonial time to now about natural resources management, I perhaps would not be able to go specifically, but again, it's about appropriation of land and separation of land from people and erasure of people's experience and connection or relation to that particular land. And in that sense, we see land as empty spaces that can be occupied. And if people are there to defend the land, they can also be erased. Now, management of spatial and marine resources, we see land and sea as things that we can utilize, that we can appropriate for our needs, and our needs is linked with the development project. I cannot speak about other parts of Indonesia, but perhaps I can mention examples. West Papua is a clear example, but also a few years ago, and actually until now, friends are struggling with the campaign of Save Aru. Aru is a small archipelago, and a few years ago there was this project of sugar plantation to take over this land to transform it into plantation, and people are still struggling. Indigenous people are still struggling for this. Also, if you're familiar with the tourist destination of Labuan Bajo in Flores Island, that there's also land grabbing, resources grabbing there that completely separate indigenous people from their land and erase them up to the point of killing them in order to get this land. And if they raise their voice, that means you're against progress, you're against development, you're against the betterment of their people. And people are still struggling for this. So the colonial logic of appropriating things are still there, and that includes the spatial and marine resource management in Indonesia today. Until we can see that land and sea are not ours to appropriate and to use as we please, and land and sea are always connected with the people who live there, then we are still living in that colonial logic. So until we disconnect with that, then I don't think we can actually contribute to the welfare of people, because the word itself is problematic. Resource management, right? I mean, like, that means we have the right to manage it and we know how to manage it. So even the term is problematic for me.
Yeah, just to, I suppose, to add to that really brilliant answer by Tamara. I mean, on the corruption front, it's not just in terms of the histories of corruption, but also very much the structures of corruption in the present, in the sense that corruption is facilitated by global systems of finance in which, you know, that money has to go somewhere, right? And it goes very conveniently into tax havens and shadowy places which are very conveniently left untouched by the international investment system, and in which Europe obviously plays a really, really big part. And also just to agree completely with the idea of resource management, and really there's so many indigenous communities in Indonesia which don't have a specific relation to the land in terms of property and in terms of individuated sort of connection to parceled up property, and instead live very much, because it's such a vast archipelago, they live very much with access to waterways, and have particular understandings of their relations with waterways and land spaces, and communities have very complex relations which go so far beyond this Western notion of property, which then gets really complicated and renders them very easily expropriatable actually from those spaces, because it becomes obviously very difficult to prove ownership when big corporations come along.
Well, thank you both for the very substantial answers. So we have time for one last question, and we have a couple of questions from the audience about race and racism. So I'm trying to combine these questions. So one anonymous attendee asked, why, maybe a question specifically to Tamara, why race and racism is so prominent in Eastern Indonesia compared to other parts of the country. And then there is another question which relates to the international aspect, and both the domestic and international are interlinked. So the question is from Willem van der Slaus, and the question is about the origin of racism during Dutch colonization, and specifically about the use of the concept of white. Since research has shown that in the Protestant Atlantic world, the concept of white was introduced in the judicial system at the end of the 17th century, early 18th century, I am wondering when the concept of white was used to describe Dutch European people in Dutch colonized Indonesia, and is there any literature about that? Who wants to start? Maybe Tamara? About the Eastern Indonesia and why it's prominent compared to the other parts?
Yes, I will try my best to answer this. I think it's quite complex, but I will try my best. First of all, in terms of, I mentioned about unification, right? Unification of this widespread archipelago to one nation state. And the Eastern Indonesia, location-wise, are very close to the Pacific. And race and racism also structured people in terms of how they look, skin color, hair type, and all this kind of things. And in that sense, although I'm not trying to generalize because you also have diversity within the eastern part of Indonesia, but it's stereotypically seen as black and curly. So stereotypically you can associate that with the image of black. And today, if we use racism as black, white, this kind of thing. In that sense, it's very easy to play into the idea of looking at us as less worthy of a human being. Also because in the hierarchy of race, we are farther from that image of white European man. And are closer to the image of subhuman, or put it bluntly, animals, right? So in that sense, it's easy to understand why then the discrimination of the eastern part of Indonesia is so prominent, because we play into race, but we also play into that stereotypical image of what does it mean to be an Eastern Indonesian person. Another aspect is the experience of colonialism. Now, experience of oppression and colonialism differ from one place to the other. For example, in the case of the Moluccas, I spoke about this. There are historians here who would be better than me in explaining this. But for example, in the case of the Moluccan, you have the history of being colonized by different European nations, including the Dutch. And under the Dutch, after all resources have been used and appropriated, after you lost your land, then what's left for you is to become soldiers under the Dutch occupation. Then in that sense, you're also being used to occupy it, or to assist the Dutch in conquering other territories. And in that sense, you're already linked to the Dutch colonial power. And in today's world, you can still hear or read the idea of the Black Dutchman, or the Dutch watchdog, for example. And in that sense, your skin color combined with the history of being seen as aligning yourself with the colonial power interplays and resulted in the marginalization of people from the Moluccas. Of course, in the West Papua, that's a different story. Race plays differently. And you can still hear the word, the term monkey being used to describe people from Eastern Indonesia, particularly from West Papua. The same term you also heard before the independence of East Timor, to describe people from the East. So yeah, that would be my answer. I hope that answered the question.
Lisa?
So, I mean, if we're not quite out of time, then I'll just add a little bit to that. I think that the question of blackness and anti-blackness in Indonesia has really, it needs to be explored much further, because it's not seen as a space in which blackness figures, but obviously, you know, the Dutch Empire is very extensive and extends to parts of Africa, extends to Suriname, and I think images and racializations of blackness have really figured within the Indonesian space much more than is actually recognized. So there's a very old story to be told there, but also in the present, the way that anti-blackness is really projected onto West Papua. A lot of this is very, very recent, actually, and you get so many different actors converging on West Papua in a very short space of time. So you really have the first kind of missionaries arriving in the 1960s, and you have Dutch missionaries, you have American missionaries, all bringing their own ideas around blackness and, you know, general deficiencies, and the kind of images that come up again and again in West Papuan racialization. It's, you know, images around intimacy figure really prominently. The idea that these people are, you know, polygamous, and their intimate practices are very much inferior to you know, the ideal European or then Indonesian and Islamic intimate practices, even though there's some massive contradictions there. And yeah, there's a lot of images and racializations that get recycled around Papuan morality, and end up being repeated by and Indonesians who have sort of official interventions into West Papuan lives and communities, of which there's very extensive interventions, not only religious from both Catholic and Islamic sort of interventions, but also public health officials. This is something that I've explored a lot in some of my research. I've spoken extensively to public health officials who speak a lot about Papuan morality and intimate habits, and yeah, so it's a very interesting form of anti-blackness which is drawing from all of these different repositories from around the world and being reproduced there.
Thank you, Tamara and Lisa, for your answers. We have reached the end of our session. I would like to thank both of our speakers for their generous and engaging contributions. And I would like to thank the audience for being with us today and for your excellent questions. Apologies for maybe not asking the questions that you have written in the chat box because of time limitations. So this session is recorded and the video will be uploaded soon, tomorrow or the day after, on the YouTube channel of the Amsterdam Institute for Social Science Research. And I want to also make an announcement about our upcoming event, which will be on the 8th of October, about decolonizing art and museum. And this will be moderated by Tasnim Anwar. You can subscribe to our newsletter, also follow us on Twitter, because we have a full program until Christmas. We will touch upon topics like art and museums, sovereignty, climate change, humanitarianism, law and migration. So you will find details of this program on our website and in the newsletter. And with this, again, a big thank you to the speakers and the audience, and I hope to see many of you in our next lecture. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.